After his father's funeral, Jake Steele Morrison returned to the old family garage for the first time in 15 years. The air hung thick with dust and motor oil, shadows dancing across rusted tools and forgotten dreams. As a Hell's Angels rider, Jake had built his life on rebellion, pushing away everything that reminded him of this place and the man who raised him here. But death has a way of calling us home. He came to clean it out, to finally close this chapter of bitter memories and unfinished conversations. Then he found the locked toolbox, the one his father guarded like a secret for 30 years. Inside were letters, photographs, and a truth that would shatter everything Jake thought he knew about the man he'd spent a lifetime resenting. What could a simple mechanic have hidden that would change a hardened outlaw forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The heavy wooden door groaned on its hinges as Jake stepped deeper into the garage, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that filtered through grimy windows, creating an almost sacred atmosphere in this temple of mechanical devotion. The smell hit him like a physical force, decades of motor oil, gasoline, and honest sweat soaked into every surface. His father's work coveralls still hung on their familiar hook by the workbench, the fabric faded blue-gray and stained with the evidence of a lifetime spent under the hoods of cars and motorcycles. Jake reached out to touch them, then pulled his hand back as if the fabric might burn him. 15 years of silence stretched between them like a chasm he'd never learned to cross. The garage hadn't changed much. Thomas Morrison's tools were arranged with military precision along the pegboard wall, each wrench and screwdriver in its designated place. Hand-drawn outlines marked where everything belonged, a system Jake remembered helping to create when he was 12 years old and still believed his father was the greatest man who ever lived. A workbench dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred by decades of use, but still solid as granite. Photo frames lined one-edge pictures of Jake as a boy, his mother smiling in her yellow summer dress, the three of them at county fairs, and Christmas mornings when the world made sense and families stayed together. Jake picked up one photograph, studying his younger self. He couldn't have been more than 8, standing proudly beside a dirt bike his father had rebuilt from scrap parts. Thomas had his hand on Jake's shoulder, both of them grinning at the camera with motor oil smudged on their cheeks. That was before everything fell apart, before his mother's cancer, before the arguments that echoed through these walls like thunder. "You were going to be different," Jake whispered to his younger self in the photograph. "You were going to stay." The motorcycle parts scattered across the garage told stories of their own. Half-finished projects his father never completed, engines in various stages of rebuild, chrome pieces waiting for restoration that would never come. Thomas had always been meticulous, never starting something he couldn't finish. The abandoned projects spoke to a man who'd lost his way somewhere in the years after Jake left. In the corner sat Jake's own motorcycle, a black Harley-Davidson that gleamed despite the dust. He'd ridden it here from the funeral, the rumble of its engine drowning out the voices of relatives offering hollow condolences. The bike represented everything he'd chosen over this place: freedom, power, the brotherhood of men who understood that sometimes you had to burn bridges to find yourself. But standing here now, surrounded by his father's life's work, Jake felt the weight of those choices pressing down on him like a physical thing. The Hell's Angels patch on his leather vest, 3 skulls with wings spread wide, marked him as a man who belonged to something bigger than himself. Yet in this space, he felt smaller than he had in years. He moved through the garage like a detective examining a crime scene, searching for clues about the man his father had become after Jake walked away. There were newer tools mixed in with the old ones, a computer set up in one corner for ordering parts, business cards from customers who'd trusted Thomas Morrison to fix what was broken in their lives. The locked toolbox sat on a shelf near the back wall, exactly where it had always been. Jake remembered being curious about it as a child, asking what was inside, being told firmly that some things were private. His father had never raised his voice about it, never seemed angry, just protective, like whatever was in there was too precious or too dangerous to share. Now, As a grown man, hardened by years of bar fights and highway brotherhood, Jake found himself just as curious as that 8-year-old boy. What secrets had his father kept locked away? What was so important that it needed to be hidden from the world, even from his own son? The afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the garage floor. Jake's phone had been buzzing with messages from his club brothers, but he'd ignored them all. This space demanded his full attention. This final conversation with a man who'd never learned how to say what mattered most. Standing there in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the ghosts of better days and the echo of unfinished business, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He was going to open that toolbox, no matter what it cost him. Some secrets, he realized, were too heavy to carry to the grave. The vibration against Jake's leg broke the spell of the garage's silence. His phone buzzed insistently, the screen lighting up with the name Diesel in bold letters. Jake stared at it for a moment, then reluctantly answered, "Steele, where the hell are you?" The gravelly voice of Marcus Diesel Rodriguez, president of the Northern California chapter, crackled through the speaker. "Church starts in 20 minutes. I'm dealing with family business," Jake said, his voice echoing off the garage walls. "Family business?" Diesel's laugh was harsh. "Brother, we are your family. Your old man's dead and buried. Time to get back to the living." Jake touched the Hell's Angels patch on his vest, feeling the raised embroidery of the Death's Head logo. These colors had been his identity for 8 years, earned through blood and loyalty, respected and feared on every highway from San Francisco to the Oregon border. The patch represented something most people would never understand, a brotherhood that transcended blood, a code that demanded everything and gave back purpose. "The Mongols are moving into our territory," Diesel continued. "Spotted 3 of their prospects at Murphy's bar last night. This ain't the time for one of our enforcers to go soft." Enforcer. The word carried weight in their world. Jake had earned that title through his willingness to do what needed doing when diplomacy failed. His reputation preceded him into every bar, every clubhouse, every parking lot confrontation. Men twice his size stepped aside when Steele Morrison walked through. "Give me tonight," Jake said. "I'll be at the compound tomorrow." "Tonight, Steele. Church is tonight. Brothers don't ask for time off from brotherhood." The line went dead. Jake stared at the phone, feeling the familiar pull of obligation. The club had rules, and those rules had kept him alive and given him purpose when the rest of the world felt like chaos. You didn't skip church without consequences. Another text came through, this one from Snake, Tommy Snake Williams, his best friend and riding partner since they'd both patched in on the same night 8 years ago. The message was simple. "You good, brother?" Jake typed back, "Define good." The response came immediately, breathing and still wearing colors. "Everything else is fixable." Snake understood him better than anyone. They'd ridden through hell together, literally and figuratively. 3 tours in Afghanistan before they'd found the club, 2 men who'd learned that some bonds were forged in fire and couldn't be broken by distance or time. Snake had been the one to sponsor Jake when he'd first shown up at the clubhouse, angry and lost after coming home from the war. The garage felt different now, invaded by the outside world. Jake's 2 lives, the son dealing with grief and the outlaw with responsibilities, collided in this space like opposing forces. The club had given him everything: brotherhood, purpose, a place where his anger was understood and channeled into something useful. But standing here among his father's tools and memories, he felt the weight of what he'd given up in return. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Snake. "Whatever you're dealing with, we've got your back." But Diesel's pissed. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jake walked to where his Harley sat in the corner, running his hand along the gas tank's smooth black surface. The bike was more than transportation. It was freedom incarnate, power-controlled, the promise that he could always leave whatever was trying to hold him down. He'd ridden away from this garage on a bike, just like this 15 years ago, choosing the open road over responsibility, adventure over stability. But the locked toolbox called to him from its shelf, like an unfinished conversation. His father had kept secrets, and Jake was beginning to understand that secrets had power. They could destroy relationships or reveal truths that changed everything. The question was whether he was brave enough to face whatever truth his father had hidden away. The patch on his vest felt heavier now, the weight of 8 years of loyalty and brotherhood pressing against his chest. The club expected absolute commitment, and Jake had never wavered before. But this garage, this place where he'd learned what it meant to be a Morrison, demanded something too. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Snake, "Cover for me tonight. Tell Diesel I'll explain everything tomorrow." The response was immediate. "You're walking a dangerous line, brother." Jake looked around the garage one more time, at the tools and photographs and the locked secrets waiting to be discovered. Maybe it's time I learned how to walk a different line. He put the phone away and turned back to the toolbox, knowing that whatever he found inside would change more than just his understanding of his father. It might change everything about who Jake Morrison was supposed to be. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the framed photograph from the workbench. The glass was dusty but uncracked, protecting the image beneath like a window into a different world. There he stood at 18, cap and gown slightly askew, diploma in one hand, while his father's arm wrapped proudly around his shoulders. Both of them were smiling, genuine, unguarded smiles that spoke of hope and possibility. He barely recognized himself. The young man in the photograph had clear eyes and an easy grin, unmarked by the scars and hard lines that now defined Jake's face. His hair was shorter then, regulation length from his brief stint in ROTC before everything went sideways. Thomas stood beside him in his best suit, the same one they'd buried him in 3 days ago, his chest puffed out with paternal pride. "Valedictorian," Jake whispered to the photograph, remembering how his father had bragged to anyone who would listen. Thomas Morrison's son, the smartest kid in Millbrook High's graduating class, bound for engineering school on a full scholarship. The future had stretched ahead like an open highway, full of promise and conventional success. That was before his mother got sick. The photographs on the workbench told the story in reverse chronological order, like looking backward through time. Jake at 16, lean and awkward, standing beside the motorcycle his father had restored for his birthday. His mother, Sarah, still radiant, despite the chemotherapy that would claim her 6 months later. The three of them, at Christmas, around a tree that sparkled with handmade ornaments Sarah had crafted during her better days. Further back, Jake at 14, helping his father rebuild a '67 Mustang engine. The pride in Thomas's eyes as his son learned to gap spark plugs and adjust timing chains. Jake at 12, covered in grease and grinning like he'd discovered the secret to eternal happiness. The garage had been their sanctuary then, a place where father and son spoke the language of horsepower and torque specifications. "We were happy," Jake said to the empty garage, his voice catching on the words. "Before everything went to hell, we were actually happy." The scholarship to UC Berkeley had been his ticket out, his chance to build something bigger than Millbrook could contain. Thomas had saved for years to make up the difference between the scholarship and actual costs, working extra shifts at the garage, taking on side jobs that kept him busy from dawn until midnight. He'd never complained, never made Jake feel guilty about the sacrifices. But when Sarah got sick, everything changed. The medical bills piled up faster than insurance could cover. The garage struggled as Thomas spent more time at the hospital than under the hood of customers' cars. Jake watched his father age 10 years in 6 months, saw the hope drain from his eyes as treatment after treatment failed to stop the cancer's relentless advance. "Stay," Thomas had pleaded after the funeral, when 18-year-old Jake announced he was enlisting instead of going to college. "Your mother wanted you to have that education. Don't throw away everything we worked for." But Jake had already made up his mind. The army would pay for college later, he'd argued. He needed to see the world, needed to do something that mattered. The truth was simpler and more painful. He couldn't stay in a place where every corner held memories of loss, where his father's grief hung in the air like smoke. The fight that followed had been epic, voices raised for the first time in Jake's memory. Thomas accused him of running away. Jake accused his father of trying to control his life. Words were spoken that couldn't be taken back, wounds opened that would never properly heal. "You're just like your grandfather," Thomas had said finally, his voice cold with disappointment. "He ran when things got tough too. Guess it runs in the family." Jake had left the next morning, backpack slung over his shoulder. not looking back as he walked away from everything that had defined his first 18 years. 3 tours in Afghanistan had followed, then the wandering years, then the Hells Angels, and the life he'd built from rebellion and anger. Now, looking at these photographs, Jake wondered what would have happened if he'd stayed. Would his father have been less lonely? Would the garage have thrived instead of merely survived? Would they have found a way to talk through their grief instead of letting it fester into resentment? The young man in the graduation photograph stared back at him with trusting eyes, believing that the future was something you could plan and control. That version of Jake had never killed anyone, never spent nights in county jail, never learned that sometimes the only family you could count on was the one you chose on the highways of America. But he'd also never known the weight of real brotherhood, the satisfaction of living by a code that meant something, the freedom that came from accepting that some bridges were worth burning. Jake set the photograph back on the workbench, careful not to disturb the others. Somewhere in this garage was the truth about who his father really was, hidden away in that locked toolbox like a secret too dangerous to share. The question was whether Jake was ready to face what he might find. The heavy-duty bolt cutters felt cold and unforgiving in Jake's hands as he pulled them from the pegboard where they'd hung for as long as he could. Remember, the tool was substantial, built for serious work, the kind his father had used to cut through rusted bolts and stubborn chain links when finesse wouldn't get the job done. Now Jake was about to use them for something his father would have considered the ultimate violation. He stood before the locked toolbox, the bolt cutters weighing heavier than they should in his grip. The lock was old but solid, a master padlock that had protected his father's secrets for 3 decades. The metal was worn smooth in places where Thomas's fingers had worked the combination countless times, opening it with the practiced ease of ritual. "What were you hiding, old man?" Jake whispered, studying the lock as if it might reveal its secrets through sheer willpower. "What was so important you couldn't trust your own son?" The garage felt different now, charged with the weight of impending revelation. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more significant. Jake's motorcycle sat silent in the corner, waiting to carry him away from whatever truth lay hidden in that box. But for the first time in 15 years, running didn't feel like an option. His phone buzzed again, another message from the club. Jake ignored it. Some things were bigger than brotherhood, bigger than the code he'd lived by since finding the Hells Angels. This moment, this choice to violate his father's privacy, felt like crossing a line that would change everything about who he was. The bolt cutters were designed to cut through steel cable and hardened chain links. A simple padlock would offer no resistance. But Jake hesitated, the tool hovering inches from the lock, his hands trembling with something that might have been anticipation or dread. "He's dead," Jake said aloud, trying to convince himself. Dead men don't need privacy. But even as he spoke the words, they felt hollow. Thomas Morrison had been many things: stubborn, prideful, disappointingly human, but he'd been entitled to his secrets. Whatever he'd locked away in this box, he'd done so for a reason. Breaking that lock felt like desecrating something sacred, violating the last boundary between father and son. Jake thought about the photographs on the workbench, the evidence of a relationship that had once been built on trust and mutual respect. The young boy in those pictures had never questioned his father's wisdom, never doubted that Thomas Morrison was a man worth emulating. That faith had been shattered by grief and adolescent anger, but maybe it didn't have to stay broken. The bolt cutters grew heavier in his hands as doubt crept in. What if whatever was in the box was meant to stay hidden? What if his father's secrets were the kind that protected people rather than betrayed them? What if opening it would destroy the fragile peace Jake had finally found in his outlaw life? But the questions that had driven him here were stronger than his doubts. 15 years of silence stretched between them like an uncrossable gulf, and this box might hold the bridge Jake needed to understand the man his father had really been. Not the idealized mechanic of his childhood memories or the disappointed parent of their final fight, but the complete human being with flaws and hopes and private struggles. Jake positioned the bolt cutters around the lock's shackle, feeling the metal settle into the tool's jaws with a decisive click. The sound echoed through the garage like a gunshot, final and irreversible. Once he squeezed those handles, there would be no going back. The lock would break, the box would open, and whatever secrets Thomas Morrison had died protecting would belong to his son. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered to the empty garage, though he wasn't sure if he was apologizing to his father's memory or to himself for what he was about to do. "I need to know. I need to understand why we couldn't talk to each other when it mattered." The bolt cutters felt solid and purposeful in his grip, a tool designed to break through barriers when other methods failed. Jake had spent 8 years learning that sometimes you had to destroy something to save it, that breaking could be a form of healing if you were brave enough to face what lay beneath the surface. His breathing slowed as he prepared to squeeze the handles. In this moment, suspended between respect and desperation, Jake realized he was about to learn something fundamental about both his father and himself. The lock represented more than just physical security. It was the symbol of everything that had remained unspoken between them, everything that had festered in silence for too long. With a sharp intake of breath, Jake began to apply pressure to the handles. The metal protested, then yielded with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the garage forever. The lock clattered to the concrete floor with a metallic ring that seemed to echo forever in the silence of the garage. Jake's hands shook as he set down the bolt cutters and reached for the toolbox lid, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The hinges protested with a soft groan as the lid opened, revealing an interior that looked nothing like what Jake had expected. Instead of tools or spare parts, the box was lined with soft felt and organized with the careful precision of someone protecting precious things. And there, nestled in the center like a sleeping secret, lay a bundle of letters tied together with a faded red ribbon. Jake stared at the bundle for a long moment, afraid to touch it. The paper was yellowed with age, and the handwriting on the topmost envelope was feminine, flowing, and completely unfamiliar. The return address was smudged but readable, E. Vasquez, with a local street address he didn't recognize. The postmark was dated just 3 years ago. His hands trembled as he lifted the bundle from the box. The ribbon was silk, soft and warm to the touch, as if it had been handled frequently. 27 letters in total, Jake counted, spanning what looked like decades based on the varying conditions of the envelopes. Some were crisp and new, others soft with age and handling. The earliest letter was postmarked 15 years ago, right around the time Jake had left for the army. His throat tightened as he realized his father had been receiving these letters for the entire time they'd been estranged. While Jake was learning to be a soldier, then an outlaw, Thomas Morrison had been living a completely different life than his son could have imagined. Jake untied the ribbon with careful fingers, feeling like an archaeologist uncovering artifacts from a lost civilization. The most recent letter was on top, dated just 6 months before his father's death. The handwriting was the same as the oldest letter, but slightly shakier, marked by the passage of time. "My dearest Thomas," the letter began, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. "I dreamed of you again last night. We were young again, dancing in your mother's kitchen while she pretended to disapprove. Do you remember how she used to say, 'We were too loud,' but she was smiling when she said it?" Jake sank onto a nearby stool, the letter trembling in his hands. This wasn't just correspondence, this was love. Raw, intimate, enduring love that had somehow existed in the shadow of his father's life without Jake ever knowing it existed. "The doctors say I'm responding well to the treatments, but we both know how these things go. I'm not afraid of what comes next, but I am afraid of leaving you alone again. You've carried so much sadness for so long, my darling. I wish I could take some of it from you." The words blurred as Jake's eyes filled with unexpected tears. His father, the strong and stoic mechanic who had never shown weakness, who had weathered his wife's death with grim determination, had been in love. Not just the distant memory of love for Jake's mother, but active, present, ongoing love with someone named Elena Vasquez. Jake flipped through the other letters, catching fragments of a relationship that had spanned decades, references to secret meetings, stolen afternoons, promises to wait as long as necessary. Elena wrote about her flower shop, about the books she was reading, about the way Thomas looked when he laughed. She wrote about missing him between visits, about the careful dance they performed to keep their relationship private. "I understand why you can't tell Jake," one letter read. He's been through so much, lost so much. But someday, when he's ready, I hope he'll understand that love doesn't diminish just because it's shared. Your heart is big enough for all of us." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Elena knew about him. She'd been thinking about him, considering his feelings, even as she loved his father. And Thomas had been protecting Jake from the knowledge of this relationship, shouldering the burden of secrecy to preserve his son's memory of his mother. Jake's hands shook as he reached for another letter, this one from early in their correspondence. The paper was soft with age, and Elena's younger handwriting was more confident, more playful. "I love watching you work," she had written. "Your hands are so gentle with broken things, so patient. You make me believe that anything can be fixed with enough care and the right tools. I think that's why I fell in love with you. You see the beauty in things that others would throw away." The garage suddenly felt too small, too quiet. Jake's entire understanding of his father's life was crumbling and rebuilding itself with each sentence he read. Thomas Morrison hadn't been the lonely, grief-stricken widower Jake had imagined. He'd been a man capable of deep love, of joy, of the kind of connection Jake had never believed possible. And Jake had walked away from all of it, too angry and hurt to see what was right in front of him. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he lifted the photograph from beneath the letters. The woman staring back at him was beautiful in a way that transcended simple prettiness, high cheekbones, dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth, and a smile that seemed to hold secrets worth keeping. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a yellow sundress that made her look like sunshine incarnate. But it wasn't Elena that made Jake's hands tremble. It was the baby she held in her arms. The infant couldn't have been more than 6 months old, with downy dark hair and eyes that were clearly going to be brown like his mother's. He was reaching up toward Elena's face with tiny fingers, and she was looking down at him with the kind of love that photographers spend their careers trying to capture. On the back of the photo, in Elena's flowing handwriting, were the words, "Miguel, age 5 months," and a date that made Jake's world tilt sideways. The photograph was taken 23 years ago. Just 2 years after Jake had left for the army, 2 years after his mother's death had torn their family apart. While Jake was learning to be a soldier, his father had been becoming a father again. Jake stared at the photo until his eyes burned, trying to process what he was seeing. This baby Miguel would be 23 now, a grown man Jake had never met, never even known existed. His father had hidden an entire second family, a whole life that had nothing to do with the bitter memories and unfinished arguments that defined Jake's relationship with him. The garage felt like it was spinning around him. Every assumption he'd made about his father's life after Jake left was crumbling. Thomas Morrison hadn't spent the last 15 years alone and grieving. He'd built something new, something beautiful, something worth keeping secret, even from his firstborn son. Jake flipped the photograph over and read Elena's inscription again, then checked the dates on several of the letters. The timeline was becoming clear. Elena and Thomas had met shortly after Jake's mother died, but their relationship had deepened after Jake left home. Maybe his absence had given his father permission to move forward with his life, to find love again without worrying about his son's approval or disapproval. "A brother," Jake whispered to the empty garage. "I have a brother." The word felt foreign in his mouth. For 33 years, Jake had been an only child, carrying the full weight of his father's expectations and disappointments. The Hells Angels had given him brothers of choice, men bound together by loyalty and shared risk. But this was different. This was blood, DNA, a connection he'd never chosen but couldn't deny. Jake studied the baby's face, looking for traces of the Morrison family features. The eyes were Elena's, but the nose and the shape of the mouth looked familiar. There was something in the way the baby held his head that reminded Jake of his father at that age, based on photos he'd seen in his grandmother's albums. What kind of man was Miguel now? Had he grown up knowing about Jake, or was he as ignorant of his half-brother's existence as Jake had been of his? Did he work with his hands like the Morrison men before him, or had he chosen a different path entirely? Was he angry, like Jake, or had he found peace in ways that had always eluded his older brother? The questions multiplied faster than Jake could process them. Elena's letters had mentioned Miguel occasionally, but always in passing, as if his existence was so natural and accepted that it didn't need explanation. She wrote about soccer games and school plays, about a boy who was good with numbers and loved to build things. She wrote about how much he looked like his father as he grew older, how Thomas's eyes would light up when Miguel mastered a new skill or asked thoughtful questions about how engines worked. Jake felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy or grief or simple regret. Miguel had gotten the father Jake remembered from his own childhood, patient, wise, present. The man who had taught Jake to change oil and gap spark plugs, who had answered endless questions about how things worked and why they mattered. Jake had thrown that relationship away in his anger, but Miguel had inherited it. The photograph showed Elena and Miguel in what looked like a park, with trees and playground equipment visible in the background. They looked happy, complete, like a family that had never known the kind of loss that had defined Jake's childhood. Elena's love for the baby was obvious in every line of her body, every expression on her face. Jake set the photograph carefully on the workbench next to the letters. His father had been living a double life for decades, maintaining relationships that brought him joy while carrying the grief of his estrangement from Jake. The weight of that must have been enormous, the careful balance between old love and new love, between the son he'd lost and the son he was raising. For the first time since entering the garage, Jake understood that his father's secrets weren't betrayals. They were acts of protection, walls built to keep different parts of his life from destroying each other. The rumble of motorcycle engines shattered the silence of the garage like thunder, deep and powerful and unmistakably familiar. Jake quickly shoved the letters and photograph back into the toolbox as two Harleys pulled up outside, their chrome gleaming in the late afternoon Sunday. He recognized the sound of those particular bikes, Diesel's Road King and Snake's Softail, tuned to perfection and loud enough to wake the dead. Jake's keys felt heavy and cold in his hand as he pulled them from his pocket, the weight of 8 years of brotherhood hanging from the familiar ring. The Harley key was worn smooth from countless miles. The Hells Angels keychain bearing the club's colors, still bright despite years of use. These keys represented freedom, power, the ability to outrun whatever was chasing him. But today, they felt more like chains. "Steal!" Diesel's voice boomed through the garage as the club president dismounted his bike. Marcus Rodriguez was a mountain of a man, 6'4" and built like a linebacker, with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail and arms covered in tattoos that told the story of 30 years in the outlaw life. His presence filled any room he entered, commanding respect through sheer force of personality. Snake followed behind him, leaner and quieter but no less dangerous. Tommy Williams moved like a predator, all coiled muscle and watchful eyes. His nickname came from a scar that wrapped around his throat like a serpent, a souvenir from a bar fight in Bakersfield that had nearly killed him. Both men wore their colors with pride, the Hells Angels patches marking them as members of an exclusive brotherhood that most people would never understand. "We need to talk," Diesel said, his eyes taking in the garage with the practiced assessment of a man who'd seen the inside of too many buildings that might need to be exited quickly. "This Mongol's situation is heating up fast." Jake nodded but didn't move toward his bike. The keys felt like they weighed 100 pounds in his hand. "What's the intel?" 3 prospects spotted at Murphy's bar, like I said. But it gets worse. Snake's voice carried the flat effect of a man reporting battlefield conditions. They were asking questions about our territory, our numbers, our business relationships. This isn't casual expansion, this is reconnaissance. The Mongols Motorcycle Club had been the Hells Angels' primary rivals for decades, a relationship built on mutual hatred and competition for the same criminal territories. Wars between the clubs had left bodies scattered across California highways, and any incursion into Hells Angels territory was treated as an act of war. "Cisco wants to hit them tonight," Diesel continued, referring to the club's sergeant-at-arms. "Take out their prospects before they can report back to their chapter. Send a message that our territory isn't negotiable." Jake's hand tightened around his keys. This was the kind of club business that required his particular skills, the ability to plan and execute violence with surgical precision. He'd done it before, would probably do it again, but today the thought of leaving this garage to go hunting felt impossible. "I need more time," Jake said finally. Diesel's expression darkened. Time for what? Your old man's dead, Steele. Whatever you're dealing with here, it's ancient history. The club needs you now, today, for business that's very much alive. Snake stepped forward, his voice softer but no less serious. Brother, I've never seen you like this. What's going on? What did you find in here? Jake looked around the garage, at the tools and photographs, and the toolbox that held secrets he was only beginning to understand. How could he explain that his entire identity was being rewritten by dusty letters and old photographs? How could he make them understand that the man they knew as Steele Morrison was discovering he'd never really known himself at all? It's complicated, Jake said finally. Complicated. Diesel's laugh was harsh and bitter. Let me tell you what's complicated, explaining to the other chapters why one of our enforcers went AWOL when we needed him most. The club doesn't run on feelings, Steele. It runs on loyalty and action. The keys in Jake's hand suddenly felt like symbols of everything he was about to lose. His bike, his colors, his brothers, the entire life he'd built since leaving this garage 15 years ago. The Hells Angels had given him purpose when he had none, family when he'd rejected his blood relatives, and a code that made sense when the rest of the world felt chaotic. But Elena's letters were still warm in his memory, and Miguel's infant face stared at him from the photograph hidden in the toolbox. Somewhere out there was a brother he'd never met, a woman who had loved his father enough to wait in the shadows for 25 years, and answers to questions Jake had been carrying for most of his adult life. The garage felt like a crossroads, a place where two different versions of Jake Morrison were about to collide with devastating force. After Diesel and Snake left with threats and ultimatums hanging in the air like exhaust fumes, Jake returned to the toolbox with trembling hands. Hidden beneath the bundle of letters, he found what he was looking for, a small white business card, its edges softened by age and handling. The lettering was faded but still readable. Elena's garden, fresh flowers for every occasion, with an address on Maple Street and a phone number written in his father's careful handwriting. Jake turned the card over in his fingers, studying it like a piece of evidence. The cardstock was thick and expensive, the kind that spoke of a business owner who took pride in quality. A small logo showed a stylized rose with delicate leaves, elegant and feminine. His father had kept this card for years, tucked away with his most precious secrets. The address was across town, in the older section of Millbrook, where Victorian houses had been converted into shops and cafes. Jake had ridden past that street countless times over the years, without ever knowing that his father's secret life was hidden just blocks from the main drag, where the Hells Angels sometimes gathered at Murphy's Bar. Elena Vasquez. The name rolled around in his mind like a prayer or a curse, depending on how he chose to see it. She had loved his father for 25 years, had given him a son, had waited patiently in the shadows, while Thomas Morrison carried the burden of being two different men to two different families. Jake's phone buzzed with another message from Snake. 1 hour to decide, brother. After that, we do this without you. But Jake was already moving toward his motorcycle, the business card clutched in his hand like a lifeline. The Harley started with its familiar rumble, powerful and reliable. But today, it felt different. Instead of representing escape, it was carrying him toward a confrontation he'd never prepared for. The ride across town took 15 minutes through streets that held a lifetime of memories. Past the high school where he'd graduated valedictorian, past the park where his mother had pushed him on swings, past the cemetery where both his parents now rested side by side. Each landmark felt charged with new meaning now that he understood how much of his father's life had remained hidden. Elena's garden sat between a used bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, its storefront painted a warm yellow that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Through the large windows, Jake could see displays of flowers arranged with an artist's eye, roses and lilies, sunflowers and baby's breath, all carefully composed to catch the light and draw customers inside. Jake sat on his bike outside the shop for 10 minutes, engine idling, watching people come and go. A young mother with a toddler emerged, carrying a bouquet of daisies. An elderly man in a suit walked in empty-handed and left with a single red rose. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that a Hells Angels enforcer was sitting outside their neighborhood flower shop, having an existential crisis. The business card was damp with sweat by the time Jake finally killed the engine and dismounted. His colors felt heavier than usual, the death's head patch marking him as dangerous in a way that seemed absurd in this setting. What was he supposed to say? "Hello, I'm the son your lover never told you about, and I've been reading your private letters." The bell above the door chimed softly as Jake entered, and the scent of fresh flowers hit him like a wave. The shop was larger than it appeared from outside, with coolers lining the walls and work tables covered with arrangements in various stages of completion. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere of calm that stood in sharp contrast to the chaos in Jake's mind. "I'll be right with you," a woman's voice called from the back room, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. Even after 23 years, he recognized that voice from the way his father used to smile when the phone rang at certain times of day. Elena Vasquez emerged from the back room, carrying a vase of white orchids, and Jake's world stopped spinning. She was older than in the photographs, silver threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. But she was unmistakably the woman from the pictures, the one who had loved his father with a patience that humbled him. She looked up at Jake and froze, the vase trembling in her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both caught in the strange recognition that passes between people who have never met but somehow know each other intimately. "Thomas," she whispered, and Jake realized she was seeing his father in his face, recognizing the Morrison features that had been passed down like an inheritance. "I'm Jake," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Thomas Morrison's son." The vase slipped from Elena's hands and shattered on the floor, sending water and orchids across the wooden planks, but she didn't look down at the mess. She couldn't look away from Jake's face, reading the story written there in scars and hard lines, and eyes that held too much knowledge of the world's cruelties. "You found the letters," she said, and it wasn't a question. Elena's hand trembled as she reached beneath the register counter, pulling out a small velvet jewelry box that looked like it had been handled countless times. Her fingers moved with the practiced ease of ritual as she opened it, revealing a simple gold wedding ring nested on a thin chain. The metal caught the afternoon light, streaming through the shop windows, gleaming with the promise of a life that had never quite come to pass. "He gave this to me 12 years ago," Elena said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "On my 40th birthday. He said he wanted to marry me properly, in a church, with you there to witness it." She lifted the chain from the box, letting the ring dangle between them like a pendulum marking time. "But you were gone, and he couldn't bring himself to move forward without his son's blessing." Jake stared at the ring, feeling the weight of years of unintended consequences pressing down on him. This small circle of gold represented everything his father had sacrificed to preserve Jake's memory of his mother, everything he'd given up to avoid forcing his son to choose between past and present. "You kept him from happiness," Jake said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. Elena's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or protection. "No, Mijo, love kept him from happiness. Love for you, love for your mother's memory, love for what your family had been before the world broke it apart." She closed her fingers around the ring, holding it like a talisman. "Your father was the most honorable man I ever knew. He would never have built his joy on someone else's pain." The shop felt too small suddenly, filled with the ghosts of choices unmade and chances lost. Jake looked around at the careful arrangements of flowers, the evidence of Elena's life built in the spaces between Thomas Morrison's visits. How many nights had she gone to bed alone, knowing the man she loved was choosing duty over desire? How many holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesday evenings had she spent waiting for phone calls that might not come? "Tell me about Miguel," Jake said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. Elena's expression softened immediately, the way all mothers' faces change when discussing their children. "He's graduating from UC Davis next month. Mechanical engineering, just like his father wanted for you." She moved behind the counter and pulled out a photo album, thick with years of documentation. He has Thomas's hands, his way of seeing how things fit together. Jake found himself looking at page after page of Miguel's life first steps, little league games, science fair projects, high school graduation. A normal childhood, documented with the love and attention of parents who believed in the power of memory. Miguel looked like a Morrison, there was no denying it. The same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes, the same slightly crooked smile that Jake remembered from his own reflection in younger days. "Does he know about me?" Jake asked. "He knows he has an older brother who left home before he was born. He knows you're in the military." Elena's voice carried careful neutrality. "Thomas didn't want him to know about the other life you chose." The Hells Angels' colors suddenly felt like a scarlet letter, marking Jake as something dangerous and unfit for family consideration. His father had protected Miguel from the knowledge that his older brother was an outlaw, just as he'd protected Jake from the knowledge that he'd built a new family after the old one fell apart. "He wants to meet you," Elena continued, turning the page to show a recent photo of Miguel working on a motorcycle engine. "He's always wondered about his big brother. Thomas used to tell him stories about when you were young, about the bikes you built together." Jake studied the photograph, seeing himself at that age, but without the anger and restlessness that had driven him away from everything stable and good. Miguel looked content, focused, like someone who'd never questioned his place in the world or wondered if love was something you had to earn through suffering. "Where is he now?" Jake asked. "At school, finals week." Elena closed the album carefully. "He comes home on weekends, helps me with the heavy lifting here at the shop. He's good with his hands, patient with difficult customers, nothing like the stories Thomas used to tell about your teenage years." The bell above the door chimed, and Elena quickly slipped the ring back into its box and tucked it away. A middle-aged woman entered looking for anniversary flowers, and Elena transformed instantly into the professional shopkeeper, helping her customer choose the perfect arrangement, while Jake stood awkwardly in the corner, feeling like an intruder in someone else's carefully constructed life. When the customer left, Elena turned back to Jake with eyes that held 25 years of questions. "Why now? Why did you come looking for me?" "Because I never knew my father at all," Jake said simply, "and maybe it's time I learned who he really was." Elena reached beneath the counter again and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back. "Miguel will be home Saturday. If you want to meet him, really meet him, come to dinner. 6 o'clock. She handed him the card. "But come as Jake Morrison, not as whatever that vest makes you. He doesn't need to see that part of the family legacy." The official document trembled in Elena's hands as she pulled it from a manila folder behind the register. The California birth certificate was crisp and formal, bearing the state seal and all the legal weight of official recognition. But it was the name written in careful block letters that made Jake's world tilt sideways: Miguel Thomas Morrison Vasquez. "Your father insisted on giving him the Morrison name," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of old arguments and careful compromises. "Even though we weren't married, even though it complicated things, he said no son of his would grow up without knowing who his father was." Jake read the document 3 times before the words truly registered. "Born 23 years ago at Millbrook General Hospital. Father, Thomas James Morrison. Mother, Elena Maria Vasquez." A legal acknowledgement of paternity that made Miguel legitimate in ways that had nothing to do with marriage certificates or social conventions. "He was there?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Never missed a doctor's appointment, held my hand through 14 hours of labor, cut the umbilical cord himself." Elena's eyes grew distant with memory. "He cried when Miguel took his first breath, said it was like watching hope come alive." The contrast hit Jake like a physical blow. When Jake was born, Thomas had been young and overwhelmed, barely knowing how to be a husband, let alone a father. But with Miguel, he'd been mature, intentional, present in ways that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. Miguel had gotten the father Jake had needed but never received. The social worker asked if we were married. Elena continued, carefully refolding the birth certificate. Thomas looked her straight in the eye and said, "Not yet, but we will be." He believed it then. We both did. Jake studied Elena's face, reading the story of 23 years of "not yet" written in the lines around her eyes. How many times had they planned a wedding that never happened? How many times had Thomas come close to choosing love over loyalty to a ghost? "What changed?" Jake asked. "You did." Elena's words were gentle but devastating. Every birthday, every Christmas, every Father's Day, he'd wonder where you were and whether you'd ever forgive him for moving on. Miguel would ask about his big brother, and Thomas would get this look like he was failing both his sons by loving us. The birth certificate felt heavier than it should in Jake's hands. This piece of paper represented more than just legal documentation. It was proof that his father had committed to Miguel in ways he'd never committed to anyone else. Thomas Morrison's name was permanently linked to this child, this family, this second chance at getting fatherhood right. Miguel doesn't know his parents never married, Elena said. As far as he's concerned, we were a normal family that just happened to keep separate homes for practical reasons. Thomas wanted it that way, said the boy, deserved to grow up without the weight of adult complications. Jake thought about his own childhood, heavy with the knowledge that his parents' marriage had been strained by financial pressure and his mother's illness. Miguel had been protected from that burden, allowed to believe in love as something simple and enduring rather than fragile and conditional. He's graduating summa cum laude, Elena continued, pride evident in every word, full scholarship to graduate school at Stanford. He wants to design clean energy systems, says he's going to save the world one engine at a time. She paused, studying Jake's face. Thomas used to say, Miguel had your brain but without the anger. Said maybe that was what happened when a Morrison boy grew up feeling safe. The words stung because they were probably true. Jake had been brilliant once, before grief and rage had redirected his intelligence toward darker purposes. Miguel had gotten the benefit of that same Morrison intellect without the trauma that had twisted it into something destructive. He asks about you sometimes, Elena said softly, wonders why his brother never comes home, never calls. Thomas always said you'd find your way back when you were ready, but... She gestured toward Jake's colors, the Hell's Angels patch that marked him as dangerous. I don't think this is what he had in mind. Jake folded the birth certificate carefully and handed it back to Elena. Maybe it's time Miguel learned that his family is more complicated than he thought. And maybe it's time you learn that family doesn't have to be complicated, Elena replied. Miguel loves easily, forgives quickly, sees the best in people. He's everything Thomas hoped you'd become if you'd stayed. The shop fell silent, except for the soft classical music and the distant hum of traffic. Jake stood at a crossroads he'd never expected to reach, faced with the reality of a brother who represented everything he might have been if he'd made different choices. Miguel Morrison Vasquez was the son Thomas had raised with intention and patience, the one who'd never broken his father's heart by walking away. Saturday dinner, Elena said finally. 6 o'clock, but Jake come alone, and come ready to explain 23 years of absence to a young man who's been waiting his whole life to meet his big brother. Back at the garage, Jake sat at his father's workbench with a manila envelope marked Last Will and Testament of Thomas James Morrison spread before him. He'd found it in the toolbox beneath everything else, as if his father had wanted it discovered last. After all, the emotional revelations had prepared the ground for practical reality. The legal document was thick with official language and notary seals, but the provisions were clear enough to make Jake's chest tighten with recognition. His father hadn't just loved Miguel, he'd planned for him, provided for him, ensured his future in ways that spoke of deep paternal commitment. To Miguel Thomas Morrison Vasquez, the will read, I leave the sum of $87,000 currently held in trust, designated specifically for completion of his undergraduate and graduate education. Additionally, I bequeath to Miguel my collection of technical manuals, precision tools, and the 1967 Mustang currently in restoration, with the understanding that he will complete the work we began together. Jake's hands shook as he read the next section. The garage itself, the building, the land, the business was to be divided equally between both sons. But there was a condition that made Jake's throat close up entirely. This bequest is contingent upon my sons working together to maintain Morrison's garage as a family business for a minimum of 2 years following my death. His father had planned reconciliation from beyond the grave, engineering a situation where Jake and Miguel would be forced to collaborate or lose their inheritance entirely. It was manipulation, but the gentle kind born of hope rather than control. Thomas Morrison had believed, even at the end, that his sons could build something together if they just had the right incentive. The education fund represented years of sacrifice. Jake did quick math in his head. $87,000 was probably every spare dollar his father had earned in the past 5 years. No new tools, no shop improvements, no luxuries for himself. Just careful saving to ensure that Miguel could attend any university that would accept him, could pursue graduate school without the burden of debt. Jake thought about his own education, the scholarship he'd thrown away, the engineering degree he'd abandoned for anger and military service. His father had been willing to sacrifice for Jake's future too, but Jake had been too proud and too hurt to accept it. Miguel had been smarter, or maybe just luckier in his timing. The technical manuals mentioned in the will were stacked neatly on shelves throughout the garage, decades of accumulated knowledge about engines, transmissions, electrical systems, diagnostic procedures. Jake had learned much of this information by osmosis as a child, absorbing it through hours spent watching his father work. But Miguel had apparently been receiving formal instruction, systematic education in the mechanical arts. The 1967 Mustang sat under a tarp in the corner of the garage, a project Jake barely remembered his father starting. According to the will, it had been a joint effort between Thomas and Miguel, a restoration that spanned multiple years and served as both bonding experience and practical education. Jake felt a stab of jealousy at the thought of his father and Miguel working side by side, passing down knowledge and tradition in ways he'd rejected. But it was the business partnership clause that truly stunned him. His father had envisioned Jake and Miguel as partners, combining Jake's military precision and leadership skills with Miguel's engineering education and natural mechanical aptitude. The will even included detailed suggestions for how they might expand the business: motorcycle restoration, vintage car work, maybe even custom fabrication projects. Your different experiences and perspectives, the will continued in a section clearly written by Thomas himself rather than his lawyer, could make Morrison's garage something special, a place where traditional craftsmanship meets modern innovation. Miguel has the education, Jake has the practical experience, and both of you have the Morrison's stubborn streak that refuses to quit when things get complicated. The document included financial projections, marketing suggestions, even preliminary sketches for shop reorganization. Thomas had spent his final years planning a future that included both his sons, imagining scenarios where their relationship could be rebuilt through shared work and common purpose. Jake laughed bitterly at his father's optimism. How could Thomas have believed that a Hell's Angels enforcer and a college-educated engineer could possibly work together? What common ground could they find beyond shared DNA and a dead father's wishes? But as Jake looked around the garage at the tools that could serve either vintage restoration or precision engineering, at the space that could accommodate both motorcycle repair and automotive innovation, he began to see what his father had envisioned. Not just a reconciliation between brothers, but a synthesis of everything the Morrison family had been and could become. The will was dated 6 months before Thomas's death, suggesting he'd been planning this inheritance structure for some time. He'd known he was sick, known his time was limited, and used that knowledge to engineer one final attempt at bringing his fractured family together. Jake folded the will carefully and sat back in his father's chair, overwhelmed by the weight of expectation and possibility. Elena's hands trembled as she pulled the final document from a separate envelope, one she'd been carrying in her purse since Thomas's funeral. The property deed was official and binding, bearing the county recorder's seal and Thomas Morrison's signature in blue ink. But it was the address that made Jake's world shift once again. 47 acres of undeveloped land in the hills outside Millbrook, purchased quietly 5 years ago and held in trust for both his sons. He called it the future, Elena said softly, spreading the deed across the flower shop's counter between them. Said it was where you and Miguel could build something that belonged to both of you, something that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with what came next. Jake studied the surveyor's map attached to the deed, trying to picture the property. The land was located in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, far enough from town to provide privacy, but close enough for reasonable access. According to the documentation, it included a creek, stands of oak and pine trees, and several meadows suitable for development. "What kind of development?" Jake asked. Elena smiled for the first time since he'd walked into her shop. That was the beauty of Thomas's plan. He didn't dictate what you should build, just that you should build it together. He used to say that if you and Miguel could find common ground, literally and figuratively, you could create something neither of you could manage alone. The deed showed Thomas had paid cash for the property, another sacrifice that represented years of careful saving and deliberate planning. 47 acres of prime foothill land wasn't cheap, even in a depressed market. Jake calculated what this must have cost his father and felt another wave of guilt at the sacrifices made for sons who'd never asked for them. He had ideas, though, Elena continued, pulling out a hand-drawn sketch from the envelope. "Look at this." The sketch was in Thomas's careful handwriting, showing rough plans for a compound that combined residential and commercial elements. There were spaces marked for workshops, a showroom, living quarters, and what looked like a motorcycle track winding through the trees. It was the dream of a man who understood both his son's talents and temperaments, who'd imagined a place where Jake's mechanical skills and Miguel's engineering education could flourish together. "He called it Morrison's Mountain," Elena said. "Said it would be part custom shop, part engineering lab, part sanctuary for men who needed space to work with their hands and think with their hearts." Jake traced the lines of the sketch with one finger, seeing his father's vision come alive on paper. The workshop spaces were designed for serious mechanical work, high ceilings, industrial power, equipment bays large enough for multiple vehicles. But there were also quiet spaces marked for design work, computer stations, areas where theoretical engineering could be translated into practical application. "The motorcycle track?" Jake asked, pointing to the winding line that snaked through the property. "For testing. Miguel's been designing modifications to existing engines, ways to make them cleaner and more efficient. Thomas thought you'd be the perfect person to help him test those theories in real-world conditions." Elena's voice carried the weight of a father's hopes. "He said you had the riding skills and Miguel had the technical knowledge, and together you could create motorcycles that honored tradition while embracing innovation." The residential section of the sketch showed two separate houses connected by a covered walkway, designed to provide privacy while encouraging interaction. Thomas had understood that reconciliation couldn't be forced, that his sons would need space to become brothers gradually, at their own pace. "There's more," Elena said, pulling out a folder marked Business Plan. Thomas spent 2 years researching the market for custom motorcycle and automotive work. He identified potential customers, calculated startup costs, even researched zoning requirements and environmental impact studies. Jake flipped through pages of his father's meticulous research. Thomas had approached the Morrison's Mountain project like an engineering problem, breaking it down into manageable components and developing solutions for every foreseeable challenge. The business plan projected profitability within 3 years, assuming both sons contributed their unique skills to the enterprise. "He believed in you," Elena said quietly. "Both of you. Even when you were gone, even when Miguel was just a child with big dreams, Thomas believed you'd find your way to each other eventually." The property deed felt like a passport to a different life, a chance to build something meaningful from the ground up. But it also represented enormous risk. Jake would have to leave the Hells Angels, abandon the only family that had accepted him unconditionally for 8 years. Miguel would have to postpone or abandon graduate school, give up the conventional success that his education had prepared him for. "What does Miguel think about all this?" Jake asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment. "He doesn't know yet. Thomas wanted you to find this first, wanted you to decide whether you were ready to be the kind of brother Miguel deserves." The weight of that responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders like a lead blanket. The acceptance letter was crisp and formal, bearing the Stanford University letterhead in elegant script across the top. Jake found it tucked carefully in Elena's photo album, positioned right after Miguel's high school graduation pictures like a natural progression from one achievement to the next. The letter congratulated Miguel Morrison Vasquez on his acceptance to Stanford's graduate program in mechanical engineering with a full research assistantship starting in the fall. "He doesn't know you exist," Elena said quietly as Jake read the letter. Thomas always planned to tell him, but the timing never seemed right. First, Miguel was too young to understand, then Thomas was afraid it would hurt him to know his brother had chosen to stay away. Jake studied the letter again, noting the date. Miguel had been accepted to one of the most prestigious engineering programs in the country, an opportunity that would set him up for a career designing systems that could change the world. And he was supposed to give that up to work in a garage with a half-brother who might turn out to be more liability than asset. "When is he supposed to start?" Jake asked. "September. But he's been having doubts." Elena's voice carried the weight of maternal concern. "He says he wants to take a gap year, maybe work in the shop and figure out what he really wants to do with his life. Thomas's death hit him hard. He's questioning everything." The irony wasn't lost on Jake. Here was a young man with every advantage Jake had thrown away, and he was considering walking away from it all just as his father died and left him a more complicated legacy than anyone had expected. "What kind of doubts?" Jake asked. Elena pulled out another photo, this one showing Miguel in a workshop setting surrounded by partially assembled engines and computer equipment. He looked focused and capable, his hands confident as they worked with precision tools. But there was something in his expression that Jake recognized, the same restlessness that had driven Jake away from conventional success. He says engineering school feels too theoretical, too removed from actual problem solving. He wants to build things that matter, not just design them on computer screens. Elena traced her finger along the edge of the photograph. "He's been working on a project modifications to motorcycle engines that could reduce emissions by 40% while actually increasing performance. But his professors say it's not sophisticated enough for serious academic research." Jake felt a stab of recognition. Miguel was experiencing the same frustration that had driven Jake to abandon his own academic prospects, the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application, between what schools wanted to teach and what the world actually needed. "Show me his work," Jake said. Elena led him to the back room of the flower shop, where she kept a small workspace Miguel used when he visited. The area was meticulously organized, with engineering textbooks shelved next to motorcycle repair manuals, computer-aided design printouts, mixed with hand-drawn sketches that showed the kind of intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught in classrooms. The centerpiece was a partially assembled motorcycle engine, clearly modified with custom components that spoke of serious engineering thought. Jake recognized the base platform, a Harley-Davidson Sportster engine, but Miguel had added innovations that showed real creativity. Variable valve timing, modified combustion chambers, an exhaust system that looked like it belonged on a space shuttle. "He's been working on this for 2 years, Elena explained. Started with one of Thomas's old engines, then began designing improvements based on principles he was learning in school. Thomas said it was like watching someone reinvent the internal combustion engine from first principles." Jake bent down to examine Miguel's work more closely. The modifications were elegant, the kind of solutions that came from understanding both theoretical engineering and practical mechanics. This wasn't the work of a student playing with ideas, this was the work of someone who might actually change how motorcycles were built. The professors at UC Davis told him this kind of work was beneath serious engineers, Elena continued. Said if he wanted to make a real contribution to clean energy, he should focus on electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cells, not trying to make fossil fuel engines slightly better. But Jake could see what Miguel was really doing. He wasn't just making incremental improvements, he was proving that traditional mechanical engineering could evolve without abandoning everything that made it powerful and reliable. It was exactly the kind of bridge between old and new that Thomas had envisioned for Morrison's mountain. "What does Miguel want to do?" Jake asked. "He wants to build a prototype, test it under real conditions, prove that his ideas work in the actual world rather than just on paper." Elena's voice carried pride mixed with worry. But he can't do that alone. He needs someone who understands motorcycles from the rider's perspective, someone who can push the limits and provide feedback that textbooks can't teach. Jake stood up slowly, understanding dawning on him like sunrise. Miguel wasn't just Thomas's son, he was Jake's intellectual equal, someone who shared the Morrison gift for seeing how things could be improved. The gap year Miguel was considering might not be a retreat from his future, but a step toward it. He needs a test rider, Jake said. He needs a brother, Elena replied. Jake's hands shook as he opened the leather-bound journal hidden at the very bottom of the toolbox, beneath all the other secrets his father had carefully preserved. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and the pages were filled with Thomas Morrison's careful handwriting, daily entries, spanning the 15 years since Jake had walked away, a record of love and loss and hope that no one was ever meant to read. The entries began simply, "Jake left today. House feels empty. Need to remember this isn't about me." But as Jake read deeper, he discovered a father's heart laid bare, struggling with decisions that had no right answers and consequences he'd never anticipated. Miguel took his first steps today, read an entry from 22 years ago. Elena cried with joy, and I wanted to call Jake so badly I had to put the phone down 3 times. My oldest son should know he has a brother who shares his stubborn streak and his mother's beautiful eyes. But how do I explain Elena without diminishing Sarah's memory? How do I tell Jake about Miguel without making him feel replaced? Page after page revealed the weight Thomas had carried, trying to honor his dead wife's memory while building a new life with Elena, attempting to be a good father to Miguel while grieving the relationship he'd lost with Jake. Every major milestone in Miguel's life was recorded alongside Thomas's anguish over Jake's absence. Miguel's high school graduation today, he gave a speech about following your dreams despite obstacles. Elena says he gets that determination from me, but I know better he gets it from his brother, the one who had the courage to walk away when staying felt impossible. I just wish Jake could see what a good man Miguel is becoming. The entries about Jake were even more painful to read. Thomas had followed his older son's life from a distance, learning about his military service through veterans networks, tracking his involvement with the Hells Angels through law enforcement contacts who owed the garage favors. Every scrap of information was recorded with the desperate attention of a man trying to piece together a relationship from fragments. Jake made sergeant today, heard from Bill Peterson at the VA office that he's being recommended for commendation. I'm proud of him, but I wish I could tell him that directly. Elena says I should try calling again, but what would I say? Congratulations on becoming the soldier I never wanted you to be. Some bridges burn so completely you can't even see where they used to stand. But it was the recent entries that broke Jake's heart completely. Thomas had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 18 months ago, and every page after that was written in the shadow of death. The handwriting grew shakier, the entries shorter, but the love remained constant. Doctors say 6 months, maybe less. Haven't told Elena or Miguel yet, need to get my affairs in order first. The hardest part isn't dying, it's leaving Miguel without a father and Jake without the chance to forgive me. I failed both my sons in different ways, but maybe they can succeed where I couldn't. Maybe they can be the family I never figured out how to build. The final entries were instructions to himself, plans for how to arrange his death to give his sons the best chance of finding each other. The toolbox, the letters, the property deed, everything had been carefully orchestrated to lead Jake through a journey of discovery that would prepare him to meet his brother. If Jake is reading this, it means he came home and found the courage to break that lock. I hope he understands that every secret I kept was meant to protect someone I loved. I hope he can forgive an old man who never learned how to balance love and loyalty without hurting someone in the process. The journal's final entry was dated just 1 week before Thomas's death. Jake, if you're reading this, I need you to know that every day you were gone was a day I missed you. Not just the boy you were, but the man you became. Elena showed me newspaper clippings about the Hells Angels. I know what people think about that life, but I also know you chose it because you needed a family that wouldn't disappoint you the way I did. I understand that choice, even if I wish it had been different. Miguel is a good man, but he's still young and he's never been tested the way you have. He has book learning but not wisdom, education but not experience. You have both, even if you don't always trust yourself to use them well. Together, you could build something that honors both your strengths. Apart, you're both incomplete in ways that will probably take years to understand. I love you both, and I believe in you both. The rest is up to you. Jake closed the journal carefully, his face wet with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. For 15 years, he'd carried the weight of his father's disapproval, the certainty that Thomas Morrison had written off his rebellious son as a lost cause. But this journal revealed a different truth. His father had never stopped believing in him, never stopped hoping for reconciliation, never stopped loving the son who'd had the courage to leave when staying felt impossible. The garage felt different now, charged with the presence of a man who'd spent his final years engineering one last chance for his family to heal itself. Jake's fingers trembled as he slipped his father's wedding ring from the chain around Thomas's neck during the funeral preparation, a ring the mortician had returned with his father's personal effects. The simple gold band was warm to the touch, worn smooth by 40 years of marriage and widowerhood, carrying the weight of vows made and kept even after death had severed them. Now Jake slipped it onto his own ring finger, feeling the metal settle against his skin like a promise he wasn't sure he was ready to make. The ring had belonged to Jake's grandfather first, then passed to Thomas when he married Sarah, then worn faithfully through 23 years of marriage and 15 years of widowerhood. Even when Thomas loved Elena, even when he built a new family, he'd never removed this symbol of his first commitment. Now it was Jake's responsibility, a tangible link to generations of Morrison men who'd understood that love required sacrifice. Jake sat in the garage's office, staring at the phone number Elena had given him for Miguel. One call would set everything in motion. The meeting between brothers who'd never known each other existed, the beginning of a relationship that could fulfill their father's dying wishes or destroy what little peace Jake had found in his outlaw life. His Hell's Angels colors hung on the back of the chair, the death's head patch seeming to watch him with empty sockets that had seen too much violence, too many bridges burned in the name of brotherhood. In 3 hours, the club would expect him at church to plan their response to the Mongols' incursion. Missing that meeting would mark him as unreliable, possibly treacherous. In the outlaw world, betrayal was punishable by exile or worse. But the ring on his finger carried different obligations. Thomas Morrison had worn it through every hardship, every disappointment, every moment when staying would have been easier than fighting for what mattered. He'd honored his commitment to Sarah even after her death, then honored his commitment to Elena and Miguel even when it meant living a divided life. Jake picked up his phone and dialed Miguel's number before he could change his mind. "Hello?" The voice was young but confident, carrying the easy warmth of someone who'd grown up feeling safe and loved. "Miguel, this is Jake Morrison, your half-brother." The silence stretched so long Jake wondered if the connection had failed. Then Miguel's voice came back, quieter and filled with wonder. "Jake, you're real?" "I'm real. I know this is a shock, but I need to tell you some things about our father, about why I stayed away for so long." Jake twisted the ring around his finger, drawing strength from its solid presence. "Would you be willing to meet me? Are you kidding? I've been waiting my whole life to meet you." Miguel's excitement was infectious, the enthusiasm of a young man who still believed that family connections were automatically good things. "Where are you? When can we meet?" "There's something you need to know first," Jake said carefully. "I'm not the brother you probably imagined. I've made some choices, lived a certain kind of life that might be hard for you to understand." "I don't care what kind of life you've lived," Miguel said immediately. "You're my brother. That's all that matters." The simple acceptance in Miguel's voice hit Jake harder than any judgment could have. This young man was prepared to love him unconditionally, sight unseen, based on nothing more than shared blood and a father's stories. It was the kind of trust Jake had spent 8 years learning not to expect from anyone. "Dad told me stories about you," Miguel continued, "about how smart you were, how you could fix anything, how you used to help him in the garage when you were my age. He said you were brave enough to leave when staying felt impossible, and that someday you'd be brave enough to come back. Jake's throat tightened. Even in his stories to Miguel, Thomas had found ways to honor the son who'd disappointed him, to frame Jake's rebellion as courage rather than betrayal. "I'm at the garage now," Jake said. "Our father's garage. There are things here you need to see, things he left for both of us." "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Miguel said immediately. "I'm leaving campus now." After hanging up, Jake sat in the gathering darkness of the garage, the ring heavy on his finger and his colors heavy on his heart. In 30 minutes, he would meet the brother who represented everything he might have been if he'd made different choices. In 3 hours, he would either be at Hell's Angels Church planning violence against their enemies, or he would be explaining to Diesel why 8 years of brotherhood had to end. The ring caught the light from the workbench lamp, gleaming with the promise of something bigger than individual desires or fears. Thomas Morrison had worn this ring through every challenge, every heartbreak, every moment when duty conflicted with comfort. Now it was Jake's turn to discover what kind of man he really was when everything he'd built was on the line. The sound of a motorcycle approaching made Jake's decision for him. Miguel was coming, and Jake would be here to meet him, wearing their father's ring and ready to honor commitments that stretched back generations. Jake's hands moved with deliberate precision as he reached for the Hell's Angels colors hanging on the chair back, the leather vest that had defined his identity for 8 years. The patches told the story of his outlaw life, his road name Steel embroidered above the Death's Head logo, the California rocker that marked his territory, the various pins and insignia that recorded his service to the Brotherhood. But now, for the first time since earning them, Jake began to remove the vest that had made him who he was. The leather felt heavier than it ever had as he pulled it over his head, the weight of 8 years of loyalty and violence and brotherhood settling in his hands like a living thing. This vest had protected him through bar fights and highway chases, had marked him as dangerous to enemies and trustworthy to allies, had given him a place in the world when everything else felt uncertain. Outside, he could hear Miguel's motorcycle approaching a newer sport bike from the sound of it, probably a Honda or Yamaha, the kind of practical machine an engineering student would choose for reliability rather than intimidation. The contrast wasn't lost on Jake. His own Harley was all chrome and thunder, built to announce its presence and demand respect. Miguel's bike was built for efficiency and performance, representing a different set of values entirely. Jake folded the colors carefully and set them on his father's workbench, next to the photographs and letters and all the other artifacts of a family he was only now beginning to understand. The vest looked smaller somehow, separated from his body, just leather and thread and symbols that meant everything to some people and nothing to others. The garage door opened and Miguel walked in, pulling off a helmet that revealed features Jake recognized immediately. The Morrison jawline, their father's intelligent eyes, but softer somehow, unmarked by the kind of violence that had etched lines around Jake's mouth and eyes. Miguel was tall and lean, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to fight for respect or prove his worth through intimidation. "Jake?" Miguel's voice carried wonder and nervousness in equal measure. "I'm Jake." He turned to face his half-brother, acutely aware of his own scars and hard edges, the way prison and war and outlaw life had marked him as dangerous. "You look like him, like Dad." Miguel smiled, and for a moment Jake saw Thomas Morrison at 23, before life had taught him that love came with a price and that good intentions weren't always enough to protect the people you cared about. "You look like him too," Miguel said, studying Jake's face with open curiosity, "but harder. Like you've seen things he never had to see." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two strangers connected by blood and a dead father's hopes, trying to figure out how to be brothers when they'd lived completely different lives. Miguel's eyes moved around the garage, taking in the tools and photographs, the evidence of Thomas Morrison's double life. "He never told me about you," Miguel said finally. "I mean, he said I had a brother, but I thought you were just gone. In the military somewhere, too busy to come home." "I was busy," Jake said quietly, "just not with anything he would have approved of." Miguel's gaze fell on the Hells Angels colors folded on the workbench, and Jake watched his face change as understanding dawned. The Death's Head logo was unmistakable, the kind of symbol that carried weight even for people who'd never been near the outlaw world. "You're one of them," Miguel said, not accusingly, but with the careful neutrality of someone trying to process unexpected information. "The motorcycle club. For 8 years, Jake confirmed, since I got out of the army. They gave me a family when I didn't think I needed one. And now," Jake looked at the colors, then at his brother, then at the ring on his finger that connected him to generations of Morrison men who'd understood that sometimes you had to choose between what was easy and what was right. "Now I'm trying to figure out if I can be the kind of brother you deserve," Jake said honestly, "the kind of son Dad hoped I could become." Miguel stepped closer, his eyes moving from the Hells Angels patch to Jake's face and back again. "What kind of brother do you think I deserve?" "The kind who won't get you killed," Jake said. "The kind who can help you build something instead of tearing things down." Outside, the sound of multiple motorcycles approaching made both brothers freeze. Jake recognized the distinctive rumble of Diesel's Road King and Snake's Softail, accompanied by at least 3 other bikes. The Hells Angels had come looking for their missing enforcer, and they'd found him at the moment of his greatest vulnerability. "Stay behind me," Jake told Miguel, his military training taking over. "No matter what happens, these are my problems, not yours." But Miguel surprised him by stepping forward instead of back. "No," he said quietly, "if you're my brother, then your problems are our problems. That's what family means." The garage door was still open, and the sound of boots on concrete announced that Jake's 2 worlds were about to collide with potentially devastating consequences. 6 months later, the brass nameplate gleamed in the morning sunlight, streaming through the garage's new skylights. Morrison and Son Restoration was etched in elegant script across polished metal, mounted prominently above the main entrance where everyone could see it. The sign represented more than just a business name. It was a declaration that the Morrison family had found a way to honor both the past and the future. Jake ran his hand along the smooth brass surface, remembering the day he and Miguel had installed it together. They'd argued for an hour about the wording, Miguel insisting it should be Morrison and Sons to acknowledge both brothers. Jake maintaining that son was more elegant and that plural pronouns would only confuse customers. In the end, they'd compromised on the singular form with the understanding that it represented their partnership rather than hierarchy. The garage itself had been transformed. Where Thomas's workspace had been cramped and cluttered, Jake and Miguel had created an open, efficient environment that combined traditional craftsmanship with modern technology. Classic motorcycles and vintage cars filled the main floor, each in various stages of restoration, while Miguel's engineering station occupied a corner equipped with computer-aided design systems and diagnostic equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to their father. The '67 Mustang their father had left unfinished now sat in the place of honor, its restoration finally complete through the combined efforts of both brothers. Miguel had handled the technical aspects, engine modifications, suspension upgrades, electrical system redesign, while Jake had focused on the bodywork and paint, bringing the classic lines back to their original glory. The car was a perfect metaphor for their partnership, respect for tradition enhanced by modern innovation. Elena emerged from the small office space they'd converted from Thomas's old storage room, carrying a vase of fresh flowers that she arranged weekly throughout the shop. Her presence had become natural and welcome, the missing piece that made Morrison and Son feel like a family business rather than just a mechanical partnership. She handled customer relations and bookkeeping while the brothers focused on the restoration work, creating a harmony that none of them had expected but all of them cherished. "The Henderson motorcycle should be ready for pickup this afternoon," she announced, consulting the appointment book that had become her domain. "Mrs. Chen called to confirm she'll be here at 3 o'clock. Jake nodded, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag. The Henderson restoration had been their first major project together, a 1930 vintage machine that had required months of research and custom fabrication to return to running condition. Miguel's engineering background had been essential for understanding the antique engine's quirks, while Jake's mechanical experience had provided the patience and craftsmanship needed for delicate restoration work. "What about the Ducati?" Miguel asked, looking up from a computer screen where he was designing a custom exhaust system for a client's racing bike. "Waiting on parts from Italy," Jake replied. "Should be here next week." The rhythm of their conversation had become natural over the months, the easy back and forth of partners who'd learned to trust each other's expertise. Miguel's theoretical knowledge complemented Jake's practical experience in ways that produced results neither could have achieved alone. They'd found their common language in the universal dialect of engines and chrome, torque specifications and design principles. Snake appeared in the doorway, no longer wearing Hell's Angels colors but dressed in simple work clothes. His weekly visits had become routine, partly to check on Jake's adjustment to civilian life, and partly because he'd developed a genuine appreciation for the restoration work. The club had been surprisingly understanding about Jake's departure, especially after Diesel had seen the quality of work being produced at Morrison and Son. "How's the shovelhead coming along?" Snake asked, referring to a 1970 Harley-Davidson he'd commissioned them to restore. "Ready for your inspection," Jake said, leading him to where the motorcycle sat gleaming under the shop lights. Miguel figured out how to increase the compression ratio without sacrificing reliability. "You're going to love how it runs." Snake ran his hand along the bike's fuel tank, admiring the flawless paint job and chrome details. "You two make a hell of a team," he said simply. "Your old man would be proud." The truth of that statement settled over the garage like a blessing. Thomas Morrison's vision had become reality through the patient work of sons who'd learned to honor their father's memory by building something worthy of his hopes. The business was thriving, the brothers had found their way to each other, and the Morrison name meant something positive in the community again. Jake looked at the nameplate one more time, then at Miguel bent over his computer, then at Elena arranging flowers with the same careful attention to detail that characterized everything in their shared life. The sign represented more than business success. It was proof that some dreams were worth waiting for, that love could survive secrets and separation, and that families could be rebuilt from the wreckage of old wounds if people were brave enough to try. Morrison and Son, the name that connected past and future, tradition and innovation, two brothers, and the father who'd believed they could build something beautiful together.